Hi, this is Lisa Feeley. Good evening, your host for An Accountable Catholic. And tonight I have with me Jim Keena, all the way from Michigan, joining us. And we have a great topic we're discussing tonight. And I want to tell you a little bit about Jim, and then I'm going to have him introduce himself as well to all of you that are listening tonight. So Jim is an author, and he is a champion of freedom. He's an educator as well. And he's written, I think, quite a few books. He can tell you about them. But the thing that I also love about Jim is in his spare time, he's a father of 8 children, or I should probably say young adults and everything now. But Jim, if you get a chance, can you introduce yourself to our audience as well and give a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. And thanks for having me on. This is a pleasure for me. As you mentioned, I'm a father, and that's one of the most important things in my life. I do have 8 children. I have 20 grandchildren.
Holy cow.
For
That's
38
great.
years, I was an executive in the automotive and computer industries. About 10 years ago, I got involved in the Tea Party movement and became very politically active, and decided about 3 years ago I wanted to transition from working in business to doing something that I was very passionate about, which, as you mentioned, is being an author and an educator. So I've written 3 books now, and I've immersed my life in this. I'm a champion of freedom.
I love it. And we need more champions of freedom. So that brings us to tonight's topic. And we're not going to try to be political. And I don't like when people say, well, and as you know, I wrote a book called An Accountable American. People say, well, it's political. It has a flag on the front and all this. But it's not political. It's our everyday life. And so tonight, we're going to talk about being a Christian, what it means to be a Christian, but with respect to understanding what's happening in our country with regards to the cancel culture. So the topic of our tonight's show is, how do you as a Christian try to understand the cancel culture? And our belief, I know your belief and my belief, is it's not what we want to believe in. So we do not want to buy into it. And in fact, I would say, as a Catholic from birth and a Christian as well, we should not buy into the cancel culture, and we should make sure we understand it, right? Which you're going to talk to us a little more about it as well, so that we understand the difference between what we really should be doing and fighting for, right? Like you just said, our conservatism and championing of freedom, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the world from Jesus's perspective from 2,000 years ago, he was a bit of a heretic. I mean, the idea that he was going to be a conformist and just accept the word that was spoken from on high in the current culture is silly, because he basically was trying to reject it all, whether it was the politics of the Roman Empire or even the orthodoxy of the Jewish structure and hierarchy that existed at the time. And the words he spoke were very revolutionary words at the time. And so there's nothing about his mission on earth that was, hey, just listen to what the authorities are saying and pay attention to them and do what they do. He came with a very different mission in mind. And that mission required a great deal of courage. It required a great deal of honesty and a great deal of speaking the truth.
Well, I love how you said that. And that's what I try to remind everyone. And again, I tried to do in my book, and I know we'll hear about yours as well. Just stick with the truth. I mean, the truth, there's an old saying, of course, the truth always sets you free, but God is all about the truth. It's just the facts, more facts, and only the facts. Follow the truth. Do not let everything you're going to hear about, which we'll talk about some today, this whole cancel culture, really don't buy into any of it, because it is, I feel, the majority of it is really opposite of what God's been preaching to us and what we are supposed to be doing as Catholics and as Christians.
That's true. And when you feel this pressure, this cancel culture pressure, which in my opinion is almost to the point of being barbaric now, because it's causing people to lose their jobs, it's upending their lives, it's forcing them to say things they don't truly believe in their own hearts. It's a very barbaric approach. And if someone has to take that approach with you, your first instinct should be, well, they're not interested in the truth. Because if they were interested in the truth, we could all speak freely and the facts would come out, the truth would come out, and we would all embrace that truth. But one side is not being allowed to speak in this public forum right now. And the side that has the megaphone simply wants to silence the truth, not to talk about the truth.
Right. And I love how, and I'm going to have you get into it. We chatted a little bit last week on, I think there's 3 or 4 components that you're going to go into. But when I think cancel culture, Jim, and I'd love to hear your thought on it, because I'm not an expert on all components of it, but I mean, we're hearing all kinds of things on critical race theory, all kinds of things on, 1619 and, how this country was really founded and discovered and based. We're hearing, we know, right, all the statues are starting to come down of our history, and some of it's bad history. I don't disagree. There's, we're not a perfect country. We're not a perfect person, right? We're not perfect people. So if you don't have perfectionism, since God was the only one that was really perfect, you're going to have missteps. But I think we've learned from those missteps. And I firmly believe that there's nothing we need to change about our country. We need to change some people, but the history and the Constitution and our freedom and our, what we really stand for as a country. And most of us as individuals, I think, are good people, especially as Christians and Catholics. I think that they're getting, swayed, I guess, tremendously by, like you said, the group that tends to have the megaphone right now, which is mainstream media and Hollywood. And they are yelling from mountaintops, right, into every medium they have, from social media to the radio. I mean, we can't get away from it. So, and I think the school system, which has just been terrible overall, and forcing, like you just said, one way, right? We can't have there's no civil discourse anymore. We can't have conversations like you and I are having today, because someone's going to get very emotional and they're going to scream and yell at you and I, Jim. And like you said, even try to get us fired or start trouble just because we have another opinion, another way to do it. But I think we have a history on our side, and we should not be canceling that from Mr. Potato Head to Mr. Coffee. I mean, come on, where's this going to end?
Yeah, our history in many ways is a wonderful history. I think the concept of the United States of America and the Constitution of America was the greatest political innovation in history. Was it perfect? No. Our founding fathers even said, hey, we're in search of a more perfect union. And they gave us a framework through which to do that. But what's happening now is not an attempt to improve our society or to make it better. It's an attempt to destroy it. And that's a much different thing. And what you're seeing now under the banner of things like critical race theory is really just a Marxian term. And we're seeing this wave of neo-Marxism that has swept over the rest of the world is now starting to sweep over America. And in the old days, the Marxists used to say, well, it's going to be the capitalists versus the workers and the industrialists. Well, that conflict never really happened in America because we had a large middle class. We had people who were shop owners and had their own private businesses, and we weren't that kind of a country. And so they took a different approach, and they said, well, if we can't create that capitalist versus workers conflict, let's create different conflicts. And so now we have a racial conflict that they're trying to manufacture, or a gender.
I was going to say, or gender, right? Race, right. Gender.
So they're looking for any conflict that they can use to drive a wedge between people in America. And the whole purpose is to destroy our constitutional system here. That's the neo-Marxist attack on our country right now.
Right. And I think personally, and maybe I'm taking it too personally, but it's to destroy religion too, because in my book, when I did over 450 hours of research, we used to be a pretty religious nation. We were founded on religious. We were godly people. And we had over 65-70% of our country would be attending church regularly just 40 years ago. And 94% of us said that we believed in God. Today, Jim, those numbers are horribly low, unfortunately. We have the lowest level of people going to church, less than 23% on a regular basis. And only 60% of our country says they even believe in God. So I think they're trying to destroy organized religion because, again, it goes against what it's going to allow them to do, which is sway our minds, right?
Yeah, and that's very true. And one of the unfortunate things, you mentioned a lot of statistics there, and they are concerning, but even within Christianity itself, right, there's a fair number of Christians now who actually embrace Marxism.
Agreed. Yep.
And part of that is a complete misunderstanding of what Marxism and Christianity have in common, which is almost nothing. Because when you look at, again, Jesus's teachings, his specific teachings, as you read them in the Gospels, for instance,
Right.
there is nothing in them. There's nothing you can point to that would suggest he advocated, public ownership of private property. He didn't advocate stealing from the rich. He didn't advocate a big government. In fact, he was a rebel against the Roman government. I mean, if he was truly a socialist, he'd have said, wow, this is wonderful. I've got the greatest, most powerful government in the history of the world. I think I'll just teach them to be socialists and away we go. That was not his mission. His mission was a very personal one. He was after personal salvation, and he was after each individual person to inspire them in their own heart and soul to be a good person. There's nothing in that supports the concept of collectivism or socialism.
Agreed completely. Now, you, when we chatted last, you had kind of a framework of helping people on what we can do, action steps we can take to try to fight off. I'm going to say this erasing of our culture. What are some of the things that you tell people, Jim, and what can we do? I'd love to hear a few of them, and then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and finish them.
Sure. Well, the first thing is we have to speak up. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is the people that have the megaphone right now and that are pushing this critical race theory, this cancel culture, this neo-Marxist attack on the country are the minority in our country. The problem is it seems like they're the majority because they control some of our institutions, like our education system, some of our mainstream media, some of our cultural institutions. They have the megaphone. And it seems like they're everywhere, but they're really not. The common ordinary person in America who still believes in America outnumbers them by millions and millions, except we're too quiet. And the worst thing we can do is remain quiet. There's strength in our numbers. We're on the right side of history here. We have to speak up and we have to stand our ground. It reminds me a lot of what happened in Nazi Germany. I read a book recently called Ordinary Men. And so the thesis of the book was, well, how could this happen? How could the horror of Nazism happen in Europe with ordinary people suddenly learning how to support it? Right. And the whole premise of the book was people simply went along a little bit at a time. Every day they said, well, I'm not going to fight it just yet. I'll go along. The next day, well, I'm not going to fight it just yet. I'll go along. I don't want the peer pressure of people disagreeing with me or reporting me to the SS or whatever. And then a year or two later, they find they're running concentration camps. And we have to prevent that from happening here in America. I'm not suggesting we're on the verge of concentration camps, but what I am suggesting is it's a complete and tragic mistake for us to be silent in the face of this attack on our country.
Right. And a lot of people get pretty upset when you say, oh my gosh, a lot of you on a certain side of the fence always bring up that. But it is very true. I mean, my dad used to tell me when I was a kid, I'll never forget it, Jim. He'll say, I used to say, Dad, because he did 3 tours in Vietnam as a lieutenant colonel. I said, why do you have to go all the way to Vietnam or, and fight these bad people? And he'd say, well, because if you don't take a stand early and, be proactive to stop stuff, then by the time they get on our soil, right, and come to us, like the Japanese did, right, then you're in a much bigger disadvantage. And I really think that's what's happened even over the last 40 years, Jim. And I think you even said earlier, it's been happening much longer. But I know that I've tracked it for 40 years. And I mean, we're just doing a little bit at a time, People don't think it's a big deal. I mean, look at this whole mask situation with our pandemic, and all of a sudden we're in the middle of it. I mean, and it's here and people are like, whoa, what happened? When did this start happening in the schools? Well, it started happening probably 40 years ago and more.
Yeah, it was more than 40 years ago. If you look at early in the 20th century in America, there was quite a push from socialism here in America, just as there had been in Europe. And when you look at what happened since then, where we had the Federal Reserve Act, where we empowered the government to print money at will, we had the Federal Income Tax Act, we had the New Deal, we had Johnson's Great Society. To your point, it's just been a gradual escalation, and it's almost like boiling a frog. Just
slow
1 week at a time, 1 month at a time, we move a little bit more towards socialism, and people just learn to live with it. But now we've gotten to the point where, as Glenn Beck would say, they're just taking their masks off at this point. During the pandemic, they basically just said we're going to suspend, the Bill of Rights, and they basically violated every single Bill of Rights in our Constitution and said we don't care anymore. We have a federal government that has sufficient power to impose its will, and by golly, we're going to do that.
Right. So we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back and get a few more ideas from you on what we ordinary people need to be doing. And I'm going to say, I like what you said earlier about there are a lot of Christians. I'm going to say there's a lot of people who call themselves Christians, and without, bringing reference to a certain man who's, pretty much at the top of our country, he calls himself a Catholic. And give me a break, please. I mean, I'm going to call it out because he's not a Catholic. And so while there are people who say they're Christian or they say they're Catholic, if you buy into this, it is polar opposite of what God taught us, I think. I mean, God made us in the image of himself. He did not make us, nor did he ever want. And we see that over and over, like you said in the Gospels, nor did he ever want me to say, oh, you're a man, I'm a female, you're black, I'm white, you're Asian, Hispanic. No one, that was never to be the issue. And we're all born the same equally in God's eyes, in his image. And that's why I have a really, I guess, a bone to pick with anybody who wants to argue that, we all have to have equal outcomes and equity and all this stuff. But we'll get to that on the backside on what we can do. So we'll take a few minutes break. Thank you so much, Jim. Everyone stay with us. We'll be right back.
Carolina Catholic Radio is excited to announce an alliance with Lisa Feeley, author of An Accountable American. Her new book offers a blueprint to every person who wants to embrace how to be accountable. Learn how positively to impact your life and the lives of anyone around you. 50% of the book profits will be donated to a local 501c3 Catholic charity, including Carolina Catholic Radio and those affiliated with us. 2020 was a tough year for many people. Consider donating to charity by buying a copy of An Accountable American, just $20 on our website. Achieving accountability is a great way to start the new year. If you want to learn how to achieve enlightenment, peace, and prosperity, this is a great start. Now back to An Accountable Catholic Radio show.
Welcome back. This is Lisa Feeley, again, your host for An Accountable Catholic, and I have with me Jim. And Jim had a great point for all of us earlier, and he's going to come tell us a few more. But one of them was we have to speak up, right? We can't just sit here and say nothing when this is happening with our children, with our friends, and our churches, right? So what else can we do, Jim?
Well, first, I'll get to two more things, but I do want to pick up on something we left off with in your comments a few minutes ago, which is this confusion within Christianity about whether they should support socialism or not. And again, I'd like to make the point that the message of Jesus was one of individual salvation. With emphasis on the word individual, there was no collective salvation in his view. It was you personally, are you going to do right or are you going to do wrong? And when you think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, someone needed help and the Samaritan came and helped. And that was part of the message of the parable. But nobody was looking, Jesus wasn't suggesting, well, we should call the Department of Stranded Travelers to help them, or call the Roman Empire to come in and help them, or call some other federal group to come in and help them. His message was, it's incumbent on you to be charitable, and it's incumbent on you to help people personally. And that has nothing to do with socialism and everything to do with the concept of the United States, which is individual accountability and individual sovereignty and being responsible for your own life.
Right. See, you're singing my song. That's exactly right. We have to be more accountable. And that means accountable for myself, much like when you're trying to tithe for your church. You can't do a lot of tithing or help anybody else if you can't get your own act together first. So, be accountable and then help your circle of influence and then help all your loved ones, right? We're supposed to help our neighbors. We're supposed to do these things.
So getting back to some things we can do, I might disappoint people a little in the sense that I think there's this feeling that, hey, if we can just elect the right politicians in 2022, everything will be fine. The war has been going on much longer than that and much deeper than that in our culture. And as you and I talked before, it really gets down to how are our kids being educated? And we've had two generations now, in my opinion, of kids being educated in this neo-Marxist view of the world and not of the older view of the world that we all cherished here, which was one of individual sovereignty and the sanctity of the individual. So we've got a couple of generations to unwind, and it has to happen through a revision of how we educate our children. If we don't win that battle, we'll never win any other battle, political or otherwise, in this country. So there's two things we can do. One of them I'm a little uncomfortable talking about, which is homeschooling. Not because it's a bad idea, but because it's hard to tell everybody in the country, hey, go homeschool your kids, because people have jobs and it's a difficult challenge to take on.
Yeah.
But to the extent that you can take it on, you have a huge advantage over the state. Because when you think about what happens to your kids in the state-run schools, for 16 years, they have your kids' attention for 8 hours a day, 36 or 40 weeks out of the year for 16 years. It's hard to overcome that influence. But if you're homeschooling, you turn that apple cart upside down. Now you have their attention and you can talk about your values and your perspective for that amount of time with your own children and not have that external influence corrupting it. I know it's a hard thing to do, though.
Yeah. Can I jump in, Jim? Sure. Could be, hopefully you agree with this, an in-between, because I know that would have been challenging for my husband and I as well. But an in-between is we put our kids in Catholic school. And then when we let them go to public school later, we were very engaged, right? I was PTO president. So, is it that you can also just stay really engaged and understand what your children are being taught? Know what their homework is? Well,
that's absolutely true. We homeschooled one of our kids, and it turned out to be a great experiment. We were using the curriculum of the state of Michigan because that's what you had to do in this particular homeschooling thing. Right. And it was actually interesting as a parent because you got a bird's eye view of what was that curriculum. You don't normally get to see that because your kid's off in school and you never really hear what they're being taught. But we actually had that curriculum in our hands and we looked at it every day and we said, this is terrible. And so we got to influence our youngster, as to why this was terrible. But that was still the curriculum of the schools. The problem, even with parochial schools, is right now you have to pay twice for school. You have to pay for the parochial school because you've chosen to go there, and you have to pay the taxes to support the public school system.
That's right.
In my view, we should move to eliminate public schools altogether. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't defund it. In my opinion, is the money should simply follow the student. And it should be a free market. There should be no such a thing as a publicly funded school. There should just be schools. That.
Yep.
And there should be the money following the student, and parents and students should be able to pick where they go and why they chose that school. And they should be able to choose one that aligns with their values and their perspective, and let the market decide how that's going to be structured.
That's right. We do it with everything else, right? Right. Insurance that we buy. This is the point, is we should have the money follow the student. I agree with you. And that way we wouldn't have all these teachers unions, right, controlling everything that's done.
Yeah, and one of the arguments against it is, well, you can't take government tax money and fund a parochial school. That's bad. But in my view, what's happening now is a funding of a religion. It's the religion of statism. And all of that money right now is being funneled through public schools that are not teaching Christianity. In most cases, they're teaching anti-Christianity. They're not teaching the U.S. Constitution. They're teaching critical race theory. They're teaching their own religion. You have no choice in that matter. And this isn't what most parents want. So the right thing to do and the most sane thing to do for our society is to let parents and students choose where they want to go.
I love it. What's one other thing we can do before we wrap up tonight? Jim, any ideas?
Well, I think we need to challenge our politicians more. And I said earlier, I think a lot of people hope that, hey, in 2022, we'll elect certain politicians and everything will be better. But there's this pendulum that happens over time in America where when the left is ascendant politically, they tend to take radical steps. And we're starting to see some of those right now, with funding new entitlements, funding new programs, inventing new rights for certain groups, whatever.
Right.
And they're very aggressive and successful at doing that. They move our society leftward when they're ascendant. And then the other political party is ascendant for a while, but they never reverse any of that. They're rather passive. And their best hope is maybe we hold the ground for a little bit where it currently is. And so over time, as that pendulum swings back and forth, we're just losing ground. We're just losing it slower than if the one party was in power all the time, but we're still losing that ground and we're losing our country.
And
I don't think we don't challenge our politicians enough. I don't want to go leftward just a little more slowly. I want to take a turn back to where we came from politically.
Right. And I was just going to say, I think what I see over time, and I do discuss this as well, I've discussed with other speakers that have come on the show too, Gus, we are not, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, this is not what we were supposed to do, is have all these politicians in there for 40, 50, 60 years or 70 years, right? I mean, they were supposed to be in there, for 6, 8, 10 years and go back to being a citizen, right? I mean, it's supposed to be citizens leading other citizens and you doing your civil duty. And I think now, in my research, I mean, over half the people in there have been there for, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean,
it's horrendous. And I agree with you that the original vision of our political structure was essentially a part-time legislature. Not only weren't they supposed to have a lot of terms, they weren't even supposed to be in Washington much of the year. They were supposed to be back home mingling with their constituents.
Right.
What's happened now is when you've got people who've been in there 30 years, 40 years, even with Mr. Biden, he's going to be moving up on 50 years.
That's right. Government. That's what I mean. Yeah.
So you create a whole new class in our culture, which is the government class. And so that class has a whole different set of interests than ordinary people in our society. And even when you send a good person to Washington now, they become so corrupted by the peer pressure and influence in the lobbyists in that class that they can't really affect any change that's positive in our country. So I agree with you that one of the things we could do that would have the most difference in our country is term limits everywhere. Senators, House of Representatives, everywhere, term limits.
That's right. And I know we've been trying hard to get that through. A lot of people have, good people. Well, so listen, we only have a few minutes left. We'd love to learn a little bit more about your books and where we can get them and what you're up to. Can you share how some of our listeners can reach you, and if they're interested in some of your books, what some of them are?
Sure. Well, first of all, I have a website. It's called jameskeena.com. So you can find all of my books on there. Plus, I write a lot of articles and express a lot of my thoughts. So if you're curious, it's a good place to go look. But the latest book that I have out is called 2084, American Apocalypse. And it's a novel. It's a mystery novel, but it's also, it extrapolates what's happening in America now into a future America in the year 2084. And I don't want to tip too many secrets here, but there's a civil war going on at that point in time. And you can almost tell for obvious reasons why we would end up there. But even beyond the Civil War, the book talks about, well, how do we get beyond that? What's the real way this country should be structured? How can people live in peace and live prosperously, successfully? And that's really what the book eventually addresses. And I think it has a very powerful message.
There are many people today that are going to be around 2084. So when you look back at George Orwell's 1984, I know that a lot of people say, look at all the stuff that's coming true. And I do think we ought to pay attention to really people that I say know what they're talking about, like you, and think you have thought things through and have really understand our history. So I really appreciate you joining us tonight. And I'd love to have you on the show in another couple of months and have you back. So
I'd love to be back. Thanks for having me on, and I fully support your mission, Lisa.
Well, we're trying to do this together, right, Jim? And I'm going to end by saying, and I think you're going to agree, but I'll let you talk for yourself. Can you be a really good Christian, especially Catholic as well, and an accountable Catholic, if you're buying into the cancel culture?
No, and the reason is because the cancel culture implies violence. Anytime that you restrict the freedom of people, you're either implicitly or explicitly imposing some sort of threat of violence against them. And if you don't allow people to speak freely, if you have that threat of violence hanging over their head, you cannot be a Christian. That was never Christ's message.
Right. And I think back to Christ's message, you can't do that as well, because then you can't believe that God made us in his image, and he made us all equally, and he made us equally in that he made us for the good, right? And to help each other and to do God's will. And he gave us talents, right? So if you believe in all that and you believe in the individual, like you said, in our responsibility, you can't believe in that and at the same time believe in all this, bad that we've done, and we're supposed to erase our history.
Well, he also gave us free will.
That's right.
Sometimes when you exercise your free will, you do some good things and you do some bad things, but that comes with it. He gave us free will for a reason. And if you say, well, the government's now going to prevent you from exercising your free will, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a path to individual salvation. That's just a path to submission.
Exactly. Very good. Well, listen, again, everyone come on back next Thursday night, 5 o'clock, and join me for our next guest. And everybody go visit James Keena. Is it jameskeena.com?
That's correct.
Terrific. And visit James and his new book coming out. Lift up your book one more time.
Here it is.
Check out 2084 American Apocalypse. And again, thank you. And we'll see you next Thursday night. This is Lisa Feeley, your host of An Accountable Catholic. Have a good evening.